Hello and welcome to Class 1 of Names, Entities, and Identity Management. For this week, we will be talking a little bit about sort of where we are and how we got here. So the introduction to identity management, we're going to talk a tiny bit about identity management as a whole across the web landscape because the term's getting used sort of in multiple ways, but it sort of is all related together. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about names and the history of identity management work in libraries, archives, and museums, and you'll have a knowledge check for this week. Week 2, we're going to dive into more of talking about the, especially with names, because we do see a lot more change in terms of identity data. So people's names changing, their careers changing, all of that kind of stuff. So we will be talking a little bit more about privacy and identity next week, and then also about sort of the ethics of the work that we do. We will talk a little bit about subjects at this point because there is a little bit of a history of subject changes in terms of changes being brought by external factors, and we'll talk a little bit about that in week 2. So we'll start having that discussion. And then week 3, we're going to talk a lot more about names and subjects across the broad landscape, which will include digital library, institutional repository, the web at large, library cataloging. So we'll kind of talk about all of that. And then we'll end up with week 4. We're going to talk about resources and how to verify and establish identities, what that process looks like, how this work is continuing and evolving. So how the work on moving from authority work from the library side of it, how it is continuing to move this work forward in terms of dealing with identity. So we'll talk a little bit about it. There's a lot to this topic at a really high level because we're still trying to sort of change how we have viewed the work that we have done in this space in libraries and looking at other communities of practice so that we can make sure that we are contributing and being part of that process. I will be sharing a lot more resources. I have some really nice diagrams and sort of one-page little workflow kinds of things and almost like an infographic kind of thing about like controlled vocabularies and things like that. Because although this class is not specifically about controlled vocabularies, when you are doing this kind of work, you are often engaging with the controlled vocabulary. So I'll share some controlled vocabulary resources after I get this session up. So each week you will have a discussion, and I do try to keep discussion a little bit fluid so that you can have sort of more free range discussion. There's a lot to talk about in this particular class because we are talking about names and subjects together and sort of how this work is changing as a whole. So there's a lot of things to look at. We will talk a tiny bit about, as we go along, about how artificial intelligence is impacting this work, and I will talk a lot more about that in week 4. So week 4, we'll really be diving into artificial intelligence, and you'll be doing some reading about artificial intelligence. So hopefully some fun, interesting things to think about as we go along. So what is identity management? Well, from the web standpoint, identity, sort of from a traditional IT view, identity management is about the authentication of user and their user role. So when you log in and you have permission to do something, that is what the traditional view of identity management is, how we are managing that user, that identity. And that's been a very traditional role in IT, is sort of setting up user accounts and assigning them permissions, deciding maybe we're going to put people in groups or organize them in some way. So maybe a particular department gets certain permissions, or maybe people within a specific department who have a specific type of job description, they would get certain permissions. The permissions can be, can you interact with data? Can you access data? Can you see data? Or are you on a public side and you're looking at data? And then what can you do as a user? So it can include both staff side users who are interacting and changing information, and also the public is considered to be a user. So when you go to a website, especially if it's a website where there is a login, and sometimes it's not easily visible that there's a login, but certainly things like LibGuides and most website management tools, there is a way for staff to get to the back end to make changes of those. And that would be, you know, those user roles and how they handle information and what they can do would be set by some kind of administrative account who can kind of do everything. But typically, the public user also has certain permissions assigned to them. Now, typically those permissions are, you can view stuff here, but that's all you can do. Or maybe you can print out information, or maybe you are allowed to log in so that your login information is sent through so you can be authenticated. So it can say that, yes, you are who you say you are, and we're going to allow you to access some resources. So sometimes as a user, you do get some additional resources, some additional permissions. You can access those things that may need a subscription, or you may be doing things like bookmarking or making a request or renewing materials or sending a message to you know, a help desk person. Or if you are working in a digital library, you may be able to download material. If you create a login, there's different kinds of rights that we assign to people to allow them to do things. But that has been a very traditional view of identity management, that whole managing of users at that authentication level, and then deciding what permissions they have as they interact with the software and the devices and the tools that we support. So that is certainly one level of identity management, and it's not exclusive to what we are thinking about when we start thinking about identity management from the metadata side of it. So from the IT side of it, we're looking at user accounts, the roles and permissions, and those really will be focused on assigning, granting, or denying access to specific things within those accounts. So each account may have, for example, you may set up groups. It could be like user, staff person, administrator, writer, editor. A lot of times with blogging software, you'll have roles like editor and writer, and then administrator, someone who has the permission to kind of do everything. So how that process works is someone either registers themselves, if there's a self-registration process, or they may have, if your system or university or whatever group it's part of, your library, your museum has some kind of authentication platform set up, then it may be that when they sign up and they say register for class for the first time, that they automatically get an account. Regardless how that process happens, if it's self-registration where they start the process themselves and then someone will, it could be an automation process that checks against a role, or it could be a person who checks and sets up their account, or it could be done just sort of automatically that they're set up, you know, when they register. There's, regardless how it happens, all of that information that they input as, or that is harvested as part of their user information, that descriptive data about themselves, that descriptive information that describes their identity, their name, any unique identifier like their social security number or student ID or anything like that, that may be a patron ID, any information that may be assigned to them uniquely will be part of that information as well. So the process starts in terms of some process to get their account started. There will be some assigning and determining what their credentials are and how they're going to log in. Maybe it's their email, maybe they have a name, maybe they just type their number in, whatever. There'll be some way that is set up, and it's typically consistent across a platform in terms of how they do it. And then once they log in, there is that authentication or authorization process that happens. So it completely goes through that process. This is an access management process, and it does involve authentication. And we're not going to be talking too much about this, but because it does overlap with identity management, especially in terms of how we see identity management talked about. So if you go out and you start Googling identity management, which you may have already done, and you start thinking, well, this doesn't seem really like what we're going to be talking about in this class, or I'm confused. Is this what we're going to be talking about in this class? It is part of identity management in some way, because it is about managing that identity of the user. But we're really more going to be more focused on the attributes of those particular users, and more importantly, for what we're going to be talking about in this class, for the people that we interact with in terms of those who contribute to the resources that we buy and purchase and acquire. And we'll be talking more about sort of the nuances of that as we go forward. But I did want to just kind of talk a little bit about access management and talk a little bit about sort of what it looks like. So here's an example of a user account. So we have them in our library catalog systems. There will be typically some kind of staff interface to that. So the user would not see this. They would see maybe their username, and they might see their address. Some newer systems will allow them to change their address and things like that. But for a lot of systems, it's very locked into, what people can do. And this is also not only where the public user would have their permissions assigned, but this is also the same interface where we'd assign those staff permissions to. So it is one of those things where we do work with identity management because we do have so many platforms we support. We work with identity management in that very traditional role of access management, rights management, user management, in terms of all the workflows and policies, and providing credentials and authorization so that people can use our systems in ways that are appropriate. But of course, the other piece of it is also to help support cybersecurity as well, too, so that we are making sure that we're protecting information appropriately. We're not giving people more permissions than they should have. All of those sort of good practices in terms of that information. So how does identity management, in terms of sort of what we're going to be talking about in this class, fit together? So identity and access management systems not only identify, authenticate, and control access for individuals who are going to be using our resources, but also the hardware and applications employees need to access it. So it is both software and hardware, and it is traditionally been viewed through that lens of the system. Sometimes it is through the lens. I think we are getting more user focused as opposed to system oriented, but because our systems are so different, each system has a little different interface in terms of how it's set up to manage those user accounts. And so because of that, we do have a tendency to still be very focused on systems. So when you're actually looking at a user account, there's typically two pieces of it. There will be the part that's the information, and up here we only just see part of that information, but we see the username, the barcode attached to this particular staff account, first name. They kind of filled in some information because it's a department, so it really doesn't have a first name, and it doesn't really have a last name because it's a department kind of thing. But they've given it some information, some descriptive information about it. This is going into their identity, that's their user account. And then this next piece of it, which is the piece that we're looking at here, where we can turn off or we can give permissions, and we can sort of make permissions more granular and do all kinds of customization and things like that. And this is whether or not we're going to allow the specific department, when they log in using the Sitka CIRCAT login username, whether or not what they're going to be able to do, whether or not they're going to be able to do anything with, say, acquisitions funding. They're not. That's not going to be one of the things that they can do. So we have all of these systems, and all of these systems, platforms, and applications that all are managing all of this information about the users, and they're also then controlling that access piece of it. So it is both. It's the descriptive information about users. So information about their name, could they probably depend upon what system they're in and what kind of account they have. It may very well include their birth date. It could include their mailing address. If you have students on campus versus off campus, it could have both addresses. It could have a lot more information, emergency contact information, all kinds of information. And certainly for staff versus, or for people working on a project or working in a system versus, end users, the information we collect may be different. So even within the same system, we may be collecting different descriptive information about our users. So there's a lot of information that is stored in those identities, and it does overlap some with what we have, at least kind of coming out of the library view and the museum view, that we've viewed as identities. And part of this, I think, is because we've been doing our thing sort of in the knowledge sector and the digital asset management sector. We've been sort of doing our thing, and IT, they manage the systems, and the systems librarians do things, and the technical folks do things, and they manage those user accounts and set them up, or administrators. Sometimes they're just called administrators. And they're the ones who are responsible for managing and then sometimes making decisions about what permissions people have. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're also making decisions like, they may not be applying any standards to how information is recorded. So, for example, they may not be determining that you must put in a mailing address. Now, a lot of our new systems, when we're setting up the patterns or we're setting up information, sort of like how we're going to handle user accounts, it will ask us, do you want to make this mandatory, or click this to make it mandatory? Or there's some kind of guided process when you're first setting up a particular group or particular users, or you're doing a migration and you're setting up your users for the first time. There will often be a discussion of, is that mandatory information? Do you want that information to be required from a particular user? And so we are working more, I think, towards standardizing user data. And certainly, I think um, as we work within these more modern systems, we will continue to see more discussion of standardization. And just like there's the ability to say, use your Google account to log into another platform or some of these other things, there are other ways to um, pass through authentication. So it's not actually using the password, but it's more using a connection, saying like, okay, Google says you're who you say you are. So we're going to count that good enough, and we're going to pass you through so that you don't have to do another login. So there are ways that we have, at least in the last several years, kind of looked for ways to minimize sometimes how many logins people have and try to make it easier. And that can also be authentication that's at the level of, say, a system or university or whatever, platform you may be using, where people no longer have to log in, or they may use something in lieu of a login. So rather than password, if they use their fingerprint or pattern, or they use their face or some other way to authenticate, especially on a mobile device, or using an authentication tool on a mobile device, then they may not have to put a password in at all. And it's that same sort of process where essentially by using that non-password approach, or using some kind of authentication tool in the middle, it just says to that system, it says like to the ILS or the digital library archive or the library's webpage, it says, well, this person is already authenticated on their phone. So because of that, we know that they are who they say they are. And there's a little bit more to it that has to be done when you set up your authentication. You typically have to say, remember this device, so that it will pass you through. Otherwise, it's going to ask you to do something to prove that you are who you say that you are. So there's a lot more that's going on with authentication. That version that I kind of talked about in terms of login is a little more of still of a simplified view, because we are continuing to try to figure out ways to deal with this. And, part of authentication, really, what's really happened with identities and users and authentication is coming out of this rise of the ability to have essentially databases. So when we are logging into something, we're actually logging into a database. Now there is a software that is on the front end, and there's, templates, and there's things that look nice for us, and forms that we fill out that, fill out information, maybe fill out a title and a name, and we put a date. Or even when you do a Facebook post, you do post, and then you can add a photo or upload an image, or assign an emotion to it, or some of the other things you can do to it. And it's the same sort of thing. We're doing that information, adding that information within a web form. So when we add information to that box, it is some kind of web form, but then the information is actually stored as data into a database. And so typically when we do log in or have the ability to log into something, typically that will mean there is a database on the back end of it, and that means it is storing data. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it gives us information in a way to work with in a different way. And from the standpoint of metadata and cataloging folks, whenever we can work with data and to be able to work with data in a database, we get a lot more power by the nature of how information is input into that database. But because we now have so many platforms, I mean, just about everything I engage with just about every day, including here in this class space, I am logging in, or my um, name, my login information is being passed through my authenticator, and everything is eventually getting me to a database if it's a web-based thing. There are some things that are going to be less database oriented. For example, like some of the Microsoft products where you may be logging in once, but if you are saving information into the cloud, then there is a database associated with that on the back end. So anytime we're logging in and we're filling out some kind of form specifically, that is very much an indicator that we are actually logging in and our data is going into a database. But as part of the rise of all of these different databases out there on the web, and all these different cloud-based products that are out there, and all this social media that's out there, and digital archives, and all kinds of things, ILSs that are now cloud-based, all those kind of things, that in addition to that, we as users, both users and practitioners of metadata, we are creating our own user account information, and we're also creating our own identities. And this is something that in the early days of the internet, there was a lot of discussion about identity management as managing your own identity. Like, what's your digital media presence, or what's your digital credibility? That was one thing that kind of was a kind of a hot term for a little while. What was your digital credibility, and what's your reputation? We still have reputation sometimes a little bit, but it really had to do with, like, how are you managing how you're presenting on the web through all this data that's been accumulated, and how do you show up on Google essentially, and how do you control that? And of course, we know there's much more to it besides just what is publicly available that kind of shows up on Google, right? Or whatever search platform. There's also the personally identifiable information that we've heard so much in the news about, at least here in the United States, things that are unique to us and that identify us very uniquely. And this can be even information if you have your fingerprints stored in any digital format, if you have had to do that for any kind of identification purpose, or background checks or work or anything like that. If it's in a digital format, then it is certainly part of that personally identifiable information. Even genetic DNA that's been done through some of these programs, although the genetic DNA, at least until 23andMe, but genetic DNA was at least had some protection around it. But it's going to be really interesting to see with a commercial company that has actual genetic DNA that would be very personally identifiable data, that if that does end up getting sold, then what does that look like for the people who have content or who have data and content within those platforms? So we have a lot of interesting, sticky conversations just to have around privacy and security of our data, our own personal data, and all of that stuff that is sort of related to this topic of descriptive data about identities, but at the same time, it's a huge topic unto itself. So I didn't want to ignore it because we're hearing a lot about PII right now. There's a lot of conversations, has been, for years about identity theft and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't want to ignore those entirely, but I wanted to kind of use those as a starting point to talk then about how we're starting to look at identity management within the library view and how that gets us to entity management. So, we're looking beyond how users gain an identity and actually starting to talk about the identity itself. So this can be from a user standpoint. It can be that us as content creators, content consumers, information professionals, how we create and interact with identity aspects. And that's really to me, that's the broadest sense of identity management because it can include that traditional identity management philosophy of user management and access rights, and then some information that we've collected about users. If we're working for a big system that's collecting a lot of identity data, maybe the healthcare environment, or we're working on some kind of government project or research project where we're collecting a lot of information about users, then certainly we're dealing a lot more with the identity data. And then we're also having a lot more discussions about privacy of data and cybersecurity and all those other pieces of it. But from a resource management viewpoint, we also are interacting with this data too. And of course, as we create data, we want to think about what our identity is going to be and how that's going to be represented as well too. So there's a lot of really interesting things to think about with identity management because it is grounded, or the foundation is in traditional library work in terms of this view of our work, but we are starting to really think about how we go beyond that and how we not only go beyond sort of this traditional view of library data and names and subjects being the two biggest categories, but how we are starting to think about how we can collaborate and partner with other communities of practice, because we've seen the rise of other communities. We've seen the rise of Wikidata, ORCID, we've seen, or ORCID, we've seen, I'm trying to think of some of the other, DPpedia, let's see, Wikidata, that's at least three that I can think of right there. But there's a really long list of different communities that are doing different things with names. And even like the Getty list of names, the Library of Congress name authority file. Even though those are two big projects, they are still kind of in the mix of sort of communities of practice. So there's sort of the library communities, there's the museum communities, there's the web communities out there doing things, there's research and scientific communities that are doing things. I follow scientific data community that is organized under a group called Pistero, and they talk a lot about identity management of researchers. And it's just a completely different way that they're talking about data, but yet it's so much what we talk about in libraries. So it's been very interesting to kind of lurk into that world on occasion and see how are they talking about identities and what do they see as the issue with managing this information and creating this information. So, I've already kind of talked about this a little bit. I've kind of alluded to it, but we haven't really talked about authorities in library data. And this is really our foundation of where we start in terms of the library view of this work. And our work in libraries on names and our work on especially on subjects. I would say subjects more than names have a tendency to cross over into many other communities. So I know when I've worked on digital humanities and I worked on institutional repository projects, I've worked on some museum projects, we didn't always follow name best practices for people's names and things like that, and there were reasons for that, but we did not always follow sort of what the library best practices would be for that. But we almost always followed either or sometimes both the Library of Congress subject headings, and then we often followed maybe Getty and uh, some of the other subject headings or terms, thesaurus that would be more targeted to a particular project. So, but always had the Library of Congress subject headings, and then another controlled vocabulary that was more targeted to the specific community or specific project. So I think subjects especially, which we'll be talking a little bit more about, especially in the next couple of weeks, but subjects really has had more appeal across a greater community of data practitioners. And it also just, I think it's also just been something that it's maybe easier to work with for system developers and programmers. I'm not really sure, like on a system side, I know I've worked in systems that have the ability to work with Library of Congress subject headings, but they really struggle. And I say this for some of the biggest digital archives, institutional repository platforms out there, that as of 2020 and 2021, they were still struggling with how to work with the format of the Library of Congress names. Um, just just being that the formatting of them was just a little bit different from sort of the expectation of what the software expected. So it was a little bit challenging to kind of see, challenging and interesting to kind of see how it worked. Some of those platforms work so well with Library of Congress subject headings, and then they really did seem to struggle with the name piece of it. So there are a lot of challenges to creating standardized and interoperable data that can easily be transferable from one system to another. It's easy to import, export, ingest, harvest. It's so much easier to move back and forth. That also facilitates searching. So the more that we can have data that is consistent across systems, the better searching will be, the better search results will be, and also the easier it will be to use artificial intelligence later on. Just because the more standardized data is, the easier it is for a system that doesn't have to do a lot of thinking, critical thinking and analysis and things like that. It would just be much easier for it to be able to handle data that's all consistent, because you can say like all of this data do this thing instead of having to write 100 exceptions as I had to with one project. But anyway, the idea with library data authorities is to help create a way to have some standardized information. And this is for our subjects and our names, and names can include, of course, um, nonprofits and festivals and conferences and things like that. So it can be events. It can also include groups of people. It can include families. It can include individuals. So really any kind of group of people working together to create or curate or put something together is handled or at least viewed through the lens of authorities and library data. The way we do that is we create standardized records, and there are very specific rules for how these records are created. These records are created, they do go into a central database for libraries. That's typically the Library of Congress name authority file, but there are projects that are looking at adding names into other platforms. So there's been a Wikidata group that's been working for a long time to make sure that names in Wikidata or do follow their best practices and all of that kind of stuff. And they've written best practices and they're working to try to do some maintenance work, which is a challenging, it's a challenging thing for anyone to undertake, for sure, even for libraries. But the idea is that if we can do this, or as we do this, the more successful we are at it, that it creates consistency in that cataloging process. It makes it easier for us to do the work. We can create some lookup tools so it can find things and we don't have to type things. We'll talk more about linked data in a few minutes, but we can use linked data, we can use artificial intelligence, and then it helps with the retrieval piece of it as well. So traditional library authorities are divided into three big buckets: name authorities, which you've already talked about; subject authorities, which we've talked a little bit about already; and then title authorities. Title authorities are kind of a unique category. This is where you would see series, like books that are grouped together in some way. Multi-part, or things that are part of something else, get very complex in terms of treatment and in terms of how we process them and describe them as metadata and cataloger workers. And I will just say right now that, if you're cataloging and you're cataloging in MARC, which is the sort of the typical format for cataloging. BibFrame's the newer version, but it's still kind of experimental. So most people are still cataloging in the MARC format. MARC has very specific rules for how things are done in terms of the formatting. And then we have some best practices that fall into that. How we handle multi-part things, or things that are part of something else. To me, having done work in both sides, on the archives and metadata side, and then also on traditional cataloging side, this is where I see one of the biggest distinctions, because at the metadata side, we typically describe something at the smallest particle, or the smallest piece of it, if we can isolate that item. If that item is unique, then we'll describe it at that level. And then typically on the cataloging side of it, like the more traditional library cataloging using RDA or whatever best practices, we typically try to describe things at the largest level in terms of what's the most inclusive of the whole. So unless there is some reason to bring out or to highlight a particular volume of a multi-volume set, we create just one record, and then we sort of describe all the volumes within that one record, because we consider them all to be related and grouped together. So that's where the title authority piece comes into it, it comes into it in terms of trying to find ways to provide some consistency. So remember, one of the goals of the authorities is to create some consistency. So to create some consistency of these things that are multi-part, that have things that are part of something else, to create some consistency of that data, and also work with the various systems, which are they do not always work the same. So that's sort of a goal that differs from the more archival side of it, which the archival side, and this sometimes is even in special collections, where an individual issue of a serial, of a journal, may have more importance, or it may be worth more, or it may be more historically significant to your community. And so because of that, you want to kind of pull that out and to highlight it. So I do think there is a real distinction there, and it comes to sort of how we handle those materials, how we view those as important, what we think our individual user communities are looking for with those materials, but in terms of trying to find some consistency for how we describe those materials, and some consistency not only in terms of how we describe them, but specifically in how the data appears for those materials. Then that's where title authorities come into this. We have not addressed, I'm going to be honest here, we have not done a good job of addressing multi-part things and things that are part of something else, that have relations to each other and relationships between each other, resources and works, not not an author who's written 15 books, because that author has a relationship to each of those books. But I'm talking about when there are books that have a relationship to each other, or versions of a particular resource like Romeo and Juliet, all the gazillions of versions and movies and all of that. We just have not done as good of a job of dealing with these things that have relationships with each other at the title level, at the work level, at the theme level, or relationships to each other when it's that multi-part kind of thing. When things have a hierarchy or relationship within the specific work, things that are like a multi-volume book or a collection of resources, or articles in a journal. A lot of times when you have doing academic cataloging, you may have a journal that has articles in it and you do no analysis of the individual articles. You looking at the serial title, at the journal title only. So, and there's good and bad reasons for that, but it does then create a challenge when you have full text content, because that is a place where we could be putting more data in, and we have not done that for a variety of reasons. One thing, it takes a lot longer to, every time you add in more information, of course, it's going to take longer. But anyway, so we really have not done a good job of the multi-part and the things that have relationships to each other. And this is my long way of saying, I think this is a stay tuned. I think we will have more conversations about this, but this is not where we are right now. Where we are right now is we are reframing our name authority work and expanding it to be more collaborative so that we can work with other communities of practice, which makes more sense because we can pool our efforts and we can maybe help each other a little bit more so that we don't have multiple communities kind of doing the same work but different, and we can kind of share more work and share more labor, and then maybe we can sort out some of these other things we need to be working on too, right? So names is something I think we spent the most time looking at because they're in some ways the easiest to understand and kind of think about. The challenges to them, to kind of how we do the work of names, I think makes the most sense to us. They're kind of, people are more dynamic than I think anyone would realize, and we'll talk a lot about that next week. And then subjects, and we see the same sort of things with subjects, but kind of thinking through how are we going to help us help our communities, and by communities, both our user communities, so that they can find what they're looking for, but also that as we are starting to accumulate more content that is maybe coming from non-traditional publishing platforms, how we can help ourselves too in terms of being able to share data between user communities and between our own communities of practice a little bit more, so that we can maybe use more, say, Dublin core data in a MARC format, or as we go forward for BibFrame, maybe we'll have ILSs that are BibFrame, MARC, and Dublin core, and can have all of those records coexist. There are already some systems that have some coexistence of records, the ability to support that somewhat, but certainly that's something we're going to be thinking about more. So I've talked about these already, but just to kind of give you a little diagram. So improved discoverability, our users will be able to find what they're looking for. Disambiguation, I haven't mentioned that, but that just means when you have different terms or different people or different different concepts, but they have the same term or very similar terms, so things that would be confusing. And I also have a glossary that has lots of terms, so I'll be sharing that. I will put that on my list to make sure that I've shared it with you. I thought I did that. I will add a list to myself. The other one, consistency, we've already talked about that, and then interoperability, to make sure that we are able to exchange data between not only institutions, but really if we can get beyond that and start to look at how we can open up our data. Really, I would love to see what we do with subjects and our data to become much more viable on the web scale. So that's my dream one day. It's been my dream for a while, so we'll see if it happens. So how does this work? Well, first we have to standardize the data. So for subjects, that means we have to choose what the subject term is going to be for a concept. And for subjects, this is going to be a process that we're going to go through. Then once we determine what our term is going to be, or the name of a person, so once we've done that, then we're going to publish it. We're going to put it in a list so that other people can find it. Because if we just decide on our own and we don't publish it, then one, that doesn't help users who would be encountering that term, but it also is not going to help with that interoperability piece of it either. So we want to be able to do both of those things. We want to be able to publish it and to be able to share what we've decided. And we also want to be able to standardize the term. And this sounds really easy. And the other piece of this is the final piece of this is so important. This is really the foundation of a controlled vocabulary. One, you have to figure out what terms you're going to use and what those terms mean. Two, you have to publish or communicate those terms to everyone who's going to be creating data. And it helps to let the users know too, so they know what terms to search for. And then three, you have to have a process for reviewing the terms and updating them. And it needs to be systematic. Now, this could be annual, it could be per request, it can be whatever frequency you want it to be, but there has to be a process to do maintenance. And this is the essence of a controlled vocabulary. A controlled vocabulary control, that means someone's in charge of it, or someone's. It can be a group, it can be automation, it can be whatever, but something or someone's in charge of that vocabulary. Someone is making a decision of what the term is going to be. Someone is deciding what the form of the term is going to be. Is it plural? Is it singular? Is it all uppercase? Is it hyphenated? Is it a phrase? Is it only one word? Is it the scientific term, the general term? There's a decision process that goes there. In an ideal world, you would be like the Library of Congress, where you write down a lot of the guidelines and why the different terms appear, and when terms are outdated, or when terms are created under an old way of creating terms and things like that. They've done a lot of documentation on Library of Congress subject headings for sure. But in an ideal world, you would at least write down, like, here's the criteria, here's how we choose or create words in our vocabulary. And then you're going to put them in some kind of list, and it could be a website. People who do my controlled vocabularies class, if you've done that, you do a spreadsheet, pretty extensive spreadsheet, but it's still a spreadsheet. And then you figure out what the review process looks like. And the reason why I mentioned controlled vocabularies is because this really is the point of it, where this is the foundation then for how we do this work. We have to have that, figure out what that term is going to be. And then the rest of it is just sort of the mechanic. So there's multiple aspects of doing identity management when you start doing description. There is the, why do you need a specific term? Where is that term going? Is it going into, say, a bibliographic record? Is it going into an institutional repository record? Is it going into a digital asset management platform? What are you using that term for? Where is it going? Who's going to be using it? What vocabulary are you choosing it from? What field you're going to put it into, or if it's an element, or it's just a form on the web and you type in subject and you type in a subject. So, but the source of that term is typically, the best practice would be a controlled vocabulary. Now, there are different levels there's sort of the controlled vocabulary. At the most simple is a list of preferred terms or selected terms. That's the most basic form of a controlled vocabulary, but we can get much more organized beyond that. So that's where we start getting into things like ontologies and things like that. So I will provide you with more information in my little sheet if you're interested in those things. But the most important thing to just know about it is that this is where, for identities, this is where our names would come from. The Library of Congress name authority file is a controlled vocabulary. We don't talk about it like a controlled vocabulary, but it is a controlled vocabulary. Library of Congress subject headings, they are a controlled vocabulary. And as we kind of wander through this, right now we're kind of looking at it in terms of where we've been. So we kind of talked about identity management as a whole. We're kind of talking about the foundation of how we're getting to entity management. So where we're getting in terms of library authorities, and then sort of how we're building on that to get to this concept of entity management. For library data and authorities, which in authorities, that does include both subjects, title, well, includes also titles, but we're not going to talk too much about titles anymore because we kind of covered it briefly. But the big two are names and subjects. So for library data, when we talk about authorities, we're most often talking about names, probably names first, I would say, and then subjects. And the part of the reason why we talk about names more in library work when we're talking about authorities, and some people, when they talk about authorities, they may mean only names, is because there is a training program that you can apply to as a librarian. You can go through the training program, and you have to go through your institution. It's pretty complex to even get part of the training program, but you are then allowed to create these names within the Library of Congress name authority file. And it is pretty cool to get to do that. But it is it does mean that there are more people who can contribute those names, but there's also more of a likelihood that we're going to catalog something or create data about it for the first time, especially when we start doing local history or archival stuff, special collections kind of stuff, things like that, where that name may not exist in any identity resource that we would look at. And so we would want to, if we have the ability to be able to contribute and to be able to create that name, so that either if we need to use that name again, we won't have to try to remember now, what did I use the last time? Let me go search. We would just be able to kind of look it up, or maybe our software would even help us and provide us with like a lookup tool or something like that. How these work in most library catalogs is that these are separate records. So if you are looking in OCLC, which in the connection platform, which is a shared database platform, it has bibliographic records. So that's the record about the resource. And then it has a way that you can see the authority file. And the authority file includes names and subjects. Now, you may say, well, names and subjects, that sounds like kind of where we're going with entities. And that is where we are going with entities. And really, entity management is just a new way of looking at authority work. So we're really just starting to kind of expand and think more about how we can do authority work differently. The identity management was something that came out probably now about 5 years ago, maybe last 5 years. And it's only been in the last year that we really have started talking about identities through entity management. So we've shifted, we sort of were going along trying to expand our view of names, and then different communities started saying, but let's do subjects too. We need to talk about both. And so then there was a new working group, and there's, I think, 5 or 6 working groups underneath that, where I'm on 2 of them right now, but there are 5 or 6 working groups for different communities that are looking at just what we're talking about here. Like, how do we build some best practices that are going to facilitate us sharing this information about subjects and names across all these different communities? And this is very new ground. So what we're going to be talking about in this class, especially as we get towards the end, there's a lot of really interesting work that's truly just happening right now, but it is building upon where we have been going for the last 4 or 5 years. So as we started looking at what we were doing in terms of moving forward with data, and how we're looking at getting out of MARC and some of these other things we're looking at, linked data, all these things we've been thinking about. it became very obvious that we have a real missed opportunity if we don't collaborate with all these other communities that are out there creating identity data, and they're creating subject headings and subject data. And so we should work together. I mean, it makes sense, right? It's like the library, museum, archive way. Let's collaborate, let's work together. So I mean, it's a really exciting time, but we still have a lot of work to do. So my hope for you for this class is that you'll get a good sense of where we're going. You'll understand how this kind of fits in with where we are right now, and kind of be able to see, as you're looking at your own work, what you should maybe be considering. So if you're more in the museums, or you're on the archival side, or maybe you're on the web, or you're doing traditional library cataloging, I want you to be able to kind of take what we talk about in this class, and as you are continuing your work and studies, just to sort of have this kind of percolating along, so that when opportunities come up, or something new comes up, or maybe a challenging name, or you just don't have the right subject. The subject isn't there yet. Or maybe you think the subject in the Library of Congress subject headings is just wrong. And you're like, yeah, my community is never going to use that. Then what are your opportunities? So to be able to kind of think outside the box, which is becoming so critical for us to be able to do, I think. So in library catalogs, and this is true for Connection, as I've already mentioned, typically we're going to have the one record that is considered to be the bibliographic record. Sometimes people call this the MARC record, but it's the record that represents the title of a particular resource. And that does include untitled works, like photographs. We make up a title for them because most of them don't have a photograph. I take millions of photographs. I very seldom give them a title. I don't think I ever have. And then we have the record for the authorities, which would be the name, the subject, or the title. And they are all in one giant authority database. They are on one called the authority file. The authority file is just the database with all the authority data in them. So the bibliographic information, we're kind of thinking about the people that are represented. So this could be like the author, it could be the illustrator, the editor, the director, the actor. It could be any person who has a hand or some role of any kind in creating or curating this resource. And we are going to determine, what are they known by? How are they known? Now, with commercially published stuff, it's pretty easy for us to figure out, because they have a public persona, and they have frequently determined how they are going to be known. You know, Tallulah Bankhead, that was her professional name. That was what she went by. That's not her real name. You know, there's a lot of that in especially in the world of entertainment, right? With people and their professional names and their stage names and pseudonyms and all that kind of stuff. So, but in the record, we want to represent them as they are represented, publicly. This is much more challenging when we get to special collections and archives and small, independent works and things like that, self-published works and things like that, because people do change how they are, and change how their name is represented. I know when I was first filling out paper at work, I went with RM Faye, and then Robin M, and then No M, and I had 3 or 4 tries before I kind of settled on how I wanted my name. And for a little while it was kind of bouncing around. There were lots of records that had different things, although I think a lot of it's more standardized now. But we want to figure out how someone is known. What are they going to be known by? And it's going to be consistent. So every time someone collects something that I've written, or photograph I've taken, or whatever, that my name's going to be consistently represented. Now, I may change how I reference myself, and then that's where we have to make that decision of, does the data need to be changed, and all of those discussions, which we'll be having next week. Oh, Oh goodness, I've got some sound effects here. Sorry about that. All right, so types of headings, and we can consider these headings, we can call them subject headings, we can call them, they're kind of the whole range here and broken down a little bit more, but we can call them the names, and we call them subject headings, and we can call them our title headings or our title authorities. So the other term that you'll hear actually three different terms kind of used interchangeably, is you'll hear the term headings sometimes. Headings is a really old library term, and it actually comes from the card catalog day. It's kind of a long discussion, but it has to do with how the information was actually typed and presented on the card. It was at the top, it was usually in bigger font or text, so it was the heading. That's probably the shortest definition of it I can think of. But it is a term that we still use, and it just kind of comes up in conversation, especially among catalogers. Sometimes it's just a term that's kind of been soaked into cataloging vernacular, I think. I don't even think most people think twice when they say headings about what they're really talking about. It's just the word. It can also mean, of course, it can mean authorities. So it's the same sort of thing. The difference between authorities and headings can be really nuanced. It can mean the same thing to some people. Some people just like headings and authorities, or maybe they're going to rattle it off by what mark field it is. So if I'm a person who talks in mark, then I may be like, well, the 100 field, meaning I'm talking about the personal name. I would not probably have a tendency to do that because I've worked on other sides, but all sides of kind of data. But if when I'm in the mark environment talking to other mark catalogers and I need to tell them which field I'm looking at or where the information comes from, I'm certainly going to direct them to that. Say, well, in this 100 field, or this 110 should be a 100, it's going to be that kind of conversation, because that's kind of our shared point of understanding of the data. But headings typically truly means any information that's kind of put into any of these particular categories. The personal names, and NARS means name, authority, record. So you may see that when you're reading things. Subjects, and subjects are topical. So it'd be, just your typical term, topical. Geographic. Library of Congress subject headings divides them this way. Other communities of practice divides them in different ways. We'll be talking more about subjects as we kind of go along. These are just kind of big buckets of headings. We also do something now where we have form terms, and these can be things more like genre and forms, where we're talking more about what something is versus what something is about. It's a comic book versus it's about comic books, that kind of thing. Corporate bodies is an old term, and again, I've got a glossary that has all these terms in it, in addition to millions of other terms for you. Corporate bodies is an old term, again, that if you're looking at old library term, so library data term. So if you're looking at some old authority data, information, or even more recent authority data, it's not an obsolete term entirely. We've not actually obsoleted it, but it is starting to fall out of usage. And corporate body does not mean a money-making institution or some kind of like celestial body that makes money, like Saturn suddenly is a place we can go visit and it's making money. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means a group of people. So we have newer terms for this, and I am hopeful that we're going to continue to see this term go away. But I did want to just kind of mention it here because it does just mean a group of people. Meetings, meetings and corporate bodies are kind of the same. They're really just groups of people, but a meeting is a little bit different in the fact that it's defined as a meeting typically. Same thing with conferences. So meetings and conferences they're not exactly the same, but how they're handled from a data standpoint is the same. We talked a little bit about titles already. We talked a tiny bit about series titles just in terms of the multi-part, so uniform, and trying to provide consistency over titles when you have many versions. The Romeo and Juliet scenario, that's a uniform title scenario where you'd want to provide Romeo and Juliet and then all the whatever titles actually on the resource itself. So you get both titles to help people find all those versions of Romeo and Juliet. Series titles, this is where we get to things that are parts of other things. And we won't talk too much about those just because there's not been a lot of discussion of those yet when it comes to entity management. Like no group I'm in yet has started talking about these, but it's going to be on my list because this is one of the things I want to see us address and fix. So I will provide you with more information about records and more information about, I'll provide some more examples and things for you to look at. I do have some bibliographic record examples I can share with you for those of you who've not looked at a lot of MARC records. And I will also share a MARC cheat sheet with you too, because I know not everybody has looked at those. You do not need to know MARC for this class. The only reason why we're really talking about MARC here is because we're talking about authorities and the history of identities, like how we're getting to entity management, and that's coming out of the library authority data. There are other communities of practice who have been evolving, like Wikidata and DPpedia. They've been evolving in terms of how they do things, but they did not have documented practices the same way that libraries have for, well, I mean, over 100 years now for subjects. So, you know, they did not have this history of the work that libraries do. So I'm not disparaging the work that they're doing. They have been doing a significant amount of work, especially to lift and to provide some stability in terms of subjects and names, and to provide some consistency of data and to try to help promote that across non-library communities. And they have done a tremendous amount of lift and work over there. So, and in some ways, I think the decisions they have made have been really great. They've talked really openly about bias in Wikipedia and things like that. So they've done a lot of really amazing work in those communities. But at the same time, so much of this is building upon the foundation. Maybe they know about what we've been doing over in libraries. I don't know. That might be a little egotistical to say that they have any idea what we've been doing over here in library land. But at the same time, we do have a long history of that. So that's kind of why this piece of it's a little more library centered. And then we'll continue to expand the worldview beyond that. So just hang with me on the MARC stuff. If you're not a MARC person, I will provide you with some resources. I have a lot of MARC cheat sheets and things like that just to kind of help you with that. The biggest thing to know about how we do records, and it has to do with the structure of data, is that we create a bibliographic record. So we create a record about the resource itself that describes the resource. And then we have this separate identity or authority record. And there is a relationship between them. So there is the connection between them, but it's a textual connection. So essentially the term has to match from one to the other. Now, we're going to talk much more about this type of, the records in week 3. We'll look some at MARC records, but we're going to look at Wikidata and a bunch of other records. So if you are a person who, is more interested in the Wikidata and DPpedia and stuff like that, we are going to look at those records too. So we're going to look at records in all, or not all, but, at least some of the major formats and some of these major projects, so you can get a better sense of what other people are doing. So as with everything, there are templates and tools. If you've never worked with MARC before, there are templates and tools out there to help in terms of working with MARC. There's even a product out there, and I'll try not to go too much deep into this, but there is a product out there called Mark Edit that is a free product, and you can actually create name authorities using some automated processes using that. It is pretty good. It does a pretty good job of that. And for those of you who are doing museum or archival work, you can actually convert records from, or you need to take records from a museum or archival project or a digital humanities project, and you want to put it into your library catalog. You can use that tool also to convert records into MARC. So it does a lot of really amazing things. It's created by one of our colleagues who has been just, I mean, he needs like a to be, if he lived in Great Britain, he would be knighted by now, I'm sure, because it's just an amazing thing. Let's see. So the other thing to know about bibliographic records, we already talked about it being the resource description, describes the resource. What's in the authority record, it contains the term that we've decided on that's in the controlled vocabulary. So because we can't link directly into most controlled vocabularies, and because library work started before electronic data, we started doing this work before we actually had digital data. So we were doing it on cards. So because of that, that's why the name matching and the term matching has been the key. Now we are moving away from that because we have been in the digital age for a little while. So we're looking at ways that we can leverage the data and move away from this matching, text matching stuff that we've been doing. And I've given you sort of where you'll see them. So you will see names in the 1XX field. So that's a range. So when you see XX in any cataloging terminology or any of my documentation, that means it's the range. So it means it can go from 100 to 199 in the MARC fields. So there's a range of 99 MARC fields for every 100th. So for the 600, then you probably figured that one out. It's 600 to 699. Now that doesn't mean that there's 999 subject fields, because with the subject fields, there are some that are going to be in the 600s, and there's only 3 of the 600 fields that are, or 6XX fields that are used for names. And for names, that would be the 600, the 610, and the 611. I don't think there might be one more, but those are the 3 for the most part. Chances are you are only going to, if you're doing any kind of catalog and metadata work, you're primarily going to be encountering a 600, because that is when you have a resource that's about a person. This could be a biography, it could be an autobiography. That's probably letters, things like that. It's about biographies mostly. I'm trying to think like what else would it be? I think biographies about autobiographies. Sometimes you will see it like artist works and things like that, where um they need to kind of pull out some that it's about someone, or yeah, but it's really just it's mostly going to be biographies. Sometimes I'm thinking art exhibits, sometimes it's just going to depend upon what those look like in terms of resources, but it's really, I would say, at least 85 to 95%, it's going to be the biographies are going to be what you see in those 600 fields. And that's primarily going to be, that's the number one field that's used for names in the 6X range, 6XX range. When we think about, as catalogers, when we think about subjects, we think about them being in the 650, that's for topical. 651 is geographic. Again, you don't need to memorize these. You don't need to, you can look up the MARC stuff. We will be primarily talking about other aspects of things. But when we are starting to look at records and data, especially in week 3 for subjects, we'll be talking a little bit more about the presentation of the data across the different formats. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about there? I think we kind of understand some of the issues that would be related to names, especially. And I think this is probably one of the easier things to understand is, sometimes people use alternate spellings. I know in my mom's family, they are Shelton, Hilton, Hilton with a Y and an I. And there's even like some other versions of really just kind of quirky versions of that. And it had to do with, of course, the fact for very early, at least in United States history, there wasn't people just wrote down, if they even had a birth certificate at all, if they didn't write it in the family Bible, they just wrote down whatever the person's name was. And so you had people who had varying levels of literacy who were recording names. And of course, then once, if your family tells you, my grandmother's a Helton with an E, and that's what her family told her she was, and that, her cousin across the way was a Hilton with an I, and that's what her family told her. What, they're still related, but they've got different spellings, and now they've got different spellings that have just now have become part of the data, right? So we do have a lot of things that happened because of historical differences. And I know with my own name dropping, there's been a O dropped and apostrophe put in and dropped, and an E and a not E and two F's, and it's just all kinds of things. So, there's all of that kind of stuff that happens historically, that then as we are capturing historic data and as we're continuing to build data and have legacy data that's starting to be accumulated, we are starting to see that alternate spellings, variations in spellings, things like that. Sometimes things just get recorded wrong. I know that there was one census my mom and I were looking at where she was like, "Oh no, they recorded that incorrectly." Like, she's like, "I know that kid wasn't that age." Like she knows from family documentation, and that the person just wrote down. I don't know if they didn't ask or they just wrote down approximately what they thought. I guess that was my great grandfather or something. But anyway, what they thought that person was, or if they ask and that person, the family member just gave them the wrong date. Who knows? And of course, when we look at subjects, the idea with authorities and names is to be able to find resources about or by that person, regardless of the different variations of their name, to be able to see everything that they have created or that they've been part of, or maybe things that are about them. And the same thing similarly happens with subjects, where we're trying to unify concepts and bring things together in a way so that people can find things. And then the other part of it is we're trying to reduce duplication in names, confusion amongst our searchers and the people using our resources, and even confusion amongst ourselves. I know from, doing some genealogy projects and helping my mom, it can be very confusing wading through names, especially when the names are, consistent, where you have the same family name that's reused and reused and reused for several generations. And then you're finding documentation and you're trying to figure out like which one of these was it, because there's like four of them with the same name. So, we are trying to, as we've become more aware of the importance of names and identities, but we've become, I think, more aware of it from a data standpoint, trying to figure out a way to make it more consistent. And there's both good and bad about that, of course. The other thing I would just like you to kind of keep in your mind, for those of you who are both Mark users and those of you who are like, "Oh, I hope I never have to learn that." I hope you never have to learn it either. But it's just to remember it was developed in the 1960s. And it is a real testament to a piece of technology from the 1960s that we are still using. And it works pretty well most of the time. So, we should be proud that it works as well as it does. And it did help transfer the data from card catalog. So it got us out of analog data into actual digital data. But we still have data that's kind of not as compatible as it could be. So I think that's one of, because everybody else has a different data standard than we do. I mean, there's very few other communities besides libraries. Some of the publishing communities, some of the vendors will use MARC, but for the most part, it's kind of just really library or library support communities. And we're going to look more examples. We'll talk more about examples. I did want to give you a couple of examples. I thought this was kind of a nice example. So this is a name heading for Apple Computer. There's been several of these that have been updated. This version was 2019. It's been updated since. you'll see that there's a lot of information here. This is actually the input version. The reason why I picked this particular record was this is actually the sort of the full view of the authority record at the time. So this is an older record, but you can kind of see a lot more information here than if you just go look at, say, the Library of Congress name authority file. You can actually see all kinds of information that you would not be able to see otherwise. There's a lot here. And there's a lot here that is coded for machines. And we are to the point where our machines are getting smarter that we don't need to tell them as much as we used to be able, that we used to have to. So, you know, we still have to follow these conventions when we're creating names because we are still working in this MARC environment. And it is a very different environment than any kind of other modern programming language. So that is a challenge for people who are doing the kind of work. The key thing to know that when you're looking at a MARC record, and like I said, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time, but this 110 field here, the one that's got the number 1 next to it, that's the formal or official name. And of course, this was at 2019. I will put into our class resources, I will put a version of this from, I'll go pull one tonight so that you can take a look at both of them if you want to. But all you need to know if you're looking at a MARC authority record is whatever is in the 100 field, 110 field, whatever that 1XX field. So it'd be that 1XX field is going to be the name that you would use. So in this at this point in 2019, if we had something that was about Apple computers or written by Apple computers, then we would use Apple Computer Inc. Now, again, it's changed since then, but at that time, that's what we were going to use. And then there's a bunch of other information that's here that kind of communicates more information, sort of bibliographic information about the nature of that particular organization, because this would be an example of a corporate body. It's a corporation, where it's located, what it sells, you know, they kind of list a few things here. Then the 410s are down there, the 4XX, so 410 number 3. Those are former names. So, you know, every time there has been a official change by the company, typically this record would get updated. And I don't know how many more times it's been updated since then, but I will post the newer version so you can kind of take a look at it and spend as much time as you want to or not to. And then there's additional information here. So there's a lot of information in an authority record. And when we start looking at other records and other types of identities, I just want you to kind of think about the format of this versus, and you can go look at this in, you know, Wikipedia or DPpedia or anything you want to, if you want to kind of see what they do in terms of Apple. You can do that as well. But you know, it's just kind of the presentation of the information, because the information is pretty basic. It's the official name, it's some information about this corporation, it's what it used to be called, it's some information about who founded it and who's sort of in charge, and then some citations, like where did they get this information from? And that's really pretty basic in terms of the information it's collecting, right? It's more the formatting of it that is a little bit hard to digest and understand. The other part that happens with a authority record, and I just happen to have this example, but I could easily gone and looked for Mary Beth Pringle's authority record so that I could show you kind of that it matches. But there is an authority record for Mary Pringle, comma, Mary Beth. Now you may look at that formatting and you think, so there's that 100 field. You remember I said 1XX? There's the 100 field. So that would be the name, Mary Beth Pringle. And you'll notice it's inverted. And this is just a convention that we have had in library data for a long time. And it has to do with how things would be filed or indexed. We would want things to be last name, comma, first name. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, we invert names. Now, certainly things like, the Pope or King Charles and whatever his official titles are, anything that's an official title is not going to have this inversion of the name. It's really just going to be individual persons that are going to fall into this category if they actually have a first name and last name. And it's just a convention. And it's not only a convention, but it's it's not even a best practice. It's a requirement if you're creating data for that name authority file. Now, if we were going to use some other kind of vocabulary, we would not use a 100 field because the 100 field says that we're following Library of Congress name authorities. So there are certain fields, all of the subject fields and the authority fields, so the subjects and the names in a library bibliographic record are very much tied to Library of Congress authorities. We do have some places where we can put other types of authorities, and we'll talk more about those in week 3, but the preference and the defining of the mark field is very much tied to Library of Congress authorities or not authorities. And that's sort of, when we talk a little bit further along about using linked data, it's sort of that division between LC, like LC is authoritative and not LC is not authoritative. I mean, from my viewpoint, that's a very limiting viewpoint because we have other communities of practice who are working very hard. And I'm hoping that we can continue to expand and think about what constitutes an authoritative entry for a controlled vocabulary terms. But for right now, they are very much defined in the MARC manual by essentially, this is LC, and then you have some other choices, and then it's kind of like not LC. And then there's even places to put in like local vocabulary, like an unpublished local vocabulary. So what name, what term? We've already talked about this, but we often do use those controlled vocabularies. That's what guides us in terms of what information we put in there. If we're working in a non-library environment, or if we're working in, say, a museum, an archive, the web space, we may be using something from one of those controlled vocabularies, or we may have created our own local vocabulary, as I've done, or we may be using any number of other vocabularies. And we do have places in a MARC record for library data where you can put those, but the preference really, it really is still mostly LC in terms of preference. There are, like I said, there are places to put those others, and we're starting to continue, I think, to grow our ability to add more non-LC, non-Library of Congress authorities. When I talk about control, that really is the management and the curating or defining of that term. So that vocabulary list. Let's see, what else do we need to talk about? We've already talked about the controlled vocabulary. Another one that I've mentioned is Getty. When I'm talking about Getty, there's Getty names, and then which is names, and you will find a lot of artists in there. Then the other big Getty vocabulary is art and architecture, which is AAT. So that's probably the other one that that would be more subjects oriented towards visual arts and certainly architecture as well. So if you were to be working in a museum, it would definitely be a vocabulary to take a look at in terms of finding terms that would be suitable. Let's see, trying to think what else we want to talk about here. We've already talked about some about partnering with other organizations. Let's see, we talked about corporate body already. We talked about individuals. one of the biggest changes as we've been continuing to go down this road is that there was no hierarchy to these categories. So when we've talked about like names and we've talked about corporate bodies like groups of people and meetings, even families, there was no hierarchy or organization that was just kind of like a bucket where we just threw, well, I mean, it really was just a database where we just threw in our terms until 2017. So in 2017, we really started this work. So this work has really been building from 2017. So we've already talked some about card catalogs. We talked some about digital authority records. So those are typically in a standard format like MARC for library data. Other formats would be RDF and XML. And sometimes libraries will create their authority records, and even though they have to create them in MARC, but they may, if they're in a library catalog, they're typically created in MARC or an ILS, same difference. They'll be created in MARC, but then they may publish them or display them using XML because that's much easier for websites to use and interact with. So the other thing we've been working on is we've been working on starting to incorporate link data in, and this is really the last big piece I want to talk about for today. So I've already talked some about how we came from doing card catalogs and we had to have text matching. And it was this process of making sure the terms matched from what was in the controlled vocabulary to what was actually in the vocabulary list. So, for example, for Terry Flanagan, if you go look at Terry Flanagan's authority file, it is Flanagan, comma, Terry, just like that. Now, you may also, and it's going to be because Terry Flanagan is as a person, an individual. If Terry writes a book or illustrates a book, if they're the primary person responsible for the creation of that book, then they're always going to go in the 100 field. If they are a co-author or something like that, then they would go in a 700 field. And this has to do with it's a complete MARC thing, because unlike other data formats, you can only have one 100 field or one 110 field. You can only have one of the 1XX fields. So you cannot repeat anything within that range in a MARC field. And again, that's a very MARC thing, but it just means that we have to make decisions as catalogers and metadata practitioners when we are working in MARC that even if people are listed co-equally, we make decisions upon what the publisher has told us or the presentation of the information. Essentially, whoever is listed first in a list of authors, creators, photographers, whatever their roles are, whoever is listed first, certainly if it's a writer, typically that person is going to get if you got a writer and an illustrator, then unless the illustrator is really the main focus, you're typically going to give the 100 field to the writer. And part of the reason why is because the MARC of how MARC is defined. So MARC will only allow one in this range, but it also has to do with how the call number is formatted. So the 100 field and the 245 and the subjects also kind of tie into how the call number is constructed when using Library of Congress subject headings and call numbers. Now, if you're working with digital objects and digital resources, call number really doesn't make a difference. There are some systems that use subjects to kind of organize things and things like that. So from a standpoint of a data standpoint, you don't need the call number because you don't have a physical resource to put onto a space. And so you don't need to have that information. But from a user standpoint, especially users who are used to seeing call numbers or maybe searching for things by call numbers, having those resources, digital and print, kind of put together, even when the digital resource doesn't actually have a physical space on the physical shelf, but maybe thinking of it more as a virtual shelf can be useful. Again, there's a lot of pros and cons there, and it depends upon systems. But when we are working with authorities, we are really talking about matching that text. Flanagan, comma, Terry. Now you see here, I did put this or with the subfield E author. There's also now a subfield for that you'll see here. So subfield can be represented by a lot of different symbols. A lot of times you'll see $sign. There's also a little thing that kind of looks like a double plus sign you'll see sometimes. I'll try to point them out if I have any examples coming along. Maybe I'll try to put in some examples like that next time so that you can kind of see both of them. But anyway, but the thing to know is that the part that's going to match is the person's name and like birth date and any title information. Their role in relationship to that resource, they're the author, they're the illustrator, the editor, whatever. That's something that we add when we're working on creating metadata for that resource, because we are making that decision based upon what we are seeing with that resource, like what their role is. So the data matching piece of it, in terms of whether the data has to match, is just the name and the attributes related to that person as they were born and died. So that would be their name, their birth date, titles, junior, whatever doctor, whatever it is that, well, I guess they wouldn't be born with doctor, but whatever might be associated with their actual identity. Whereas author is the role that they played with that resource, and that's something that we add after the fact. Typically, you will see author listed when you're looking at that authority record, and it had kind of all those different aspects of Apple, and like it's a computer company and this, that, and the other. That's where we would see something for a person. We would see something about author, and then we might see their books listed down below or some discussion of their books. The problem with this approach is that if Terry's name changes, guess what? We have to manually fix it. There are ways to fix it using batch processes, but that's been a more newer thing. I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe it's become much more common to fix things automatically. And there was a company for the longest time that supported doing, essentially they'd go in and just do these big batch jobs and just fix, for especially for large libraries, large systems, where they might fix all the library's records for a particular name when it changed. So this just becomes, having to keep up with this becomes a big deal. And this is really where we get to this idea of linked data. So linked data is just a mechanism to facilitate data sharing. We can think of it as really linking data together, exactly what it says. So rather than typing in data or reusing data, we're linking data together. It's a bridge between data. And it also builds a relationship. So it's another way that we can build relationships within the data. So this could mean that we could also link to other things. So we could link to other authoritative resources. We could link to something within a website. So there's lots of ways that we can link to resources beyond just linking to authoritative information. But the idea behind this is that rather than typing in a person's name that has to be updated, that we would type in a URI, which would be an address and a URL. So a URL is Uniform Resource Identifier, but typically what we want is one that's done as a URL. So it's done as a link so that we can then have actionable data that we can use. And this is not just any website. So not any website can be a URI. It has to be unique and it needs to have data associated with it. So if I go to the address that has essentially contains Terry's identity, and I'm able to link to that, then another system or my system could display information about Terry, maybe even like their author bio or book reviews or whatever we might want to do. So it really is about taking a term and linking out to something else. So, or sorry, taking a URL and then linking out to, so in this case, linking to political violence, so that when someone's searching for political violence, they're going to find all of those resources that have that URL associated with it, that URI. And the system can do a lot of different things with it because it is actionable data. So they could display on the code side for us, or maybe we're just going to see the link, or maybe we're going to just see political violence. Maybe we don't see anything different from what the patron sees. But when we're creating this data, we would need to either look up and pull the link in somehow so that we get the link, or we would need to encode the link in ourselves some way. Many systems now, especially the museum archival systems, do have lookup functionality across subjects at least, so that you can start typing in political and it'll start bringing you up the list of subject headings related to political that start with political, and then you just pick off of that and it creates the link on the back end for you. The benefit to doing this is that we then are not maintaining this if Terry's name changes. So in our old system over here, in a MARC file, we have, there's Terry Flanagan. There's that text string. If Terry's name changes, then we have to fix it somehow in the data because it's just text. However, and this is a bib frame record, but if we look over here, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but where it says agent, so agent is sort of a newer name, a newer term for person. It's kind of where we're going in terms of thinking to the future a little bit. Then we see, instead of Terry's name, we actually see just a URL. And that URL is a URI because it is unique, and it unique to Terry, and it does contain actionable data. And then there's some other, we have the linking relationships, that author information, and some other stuff. Again, same sort of thing. This is a Dublin Core record, so I'm not going to go into all the Dublin Core stuff for you, but there's lots of, I will share some more Dublin Core stuff with you for those of you who are interested. Some of you will be like, oh, she just shares so much stuff. That's okay. I want to make sure everybody who has an interest, I provide them with some information. So Dublin Core, there's that whale, 1984. So that is a text string, right? And it's the creator. So that's akin to that 100 field in a MARC record. And if we come down here a little bit further, we see that we actually, for our subject, so we have for the creator, we have just put into that the information that's just the text screen. And if we go down a little bit further down towards the bottom here, we see for our subjects, then we're actually linking out to, for the Library of Congress subject heading hip hop, we can see we're actually linking out to a URL. And in this case, we have linking to the URL, but then it's publishing. So it's showing the hip hop term. So in this case, we have both. And this is sort of the approach that we're taking with what we're doing right now with linked data and library data records. So I talked a little bit about URIs already, and I just wanted to kind of give you, these have been around for a long time. It's from Tim Berners-Lee, four rules of the internet. And basically it's just about, we should be creating linked data. I mean, that's just the that's just the short answer of it, that we should use URIs. They should be links. So an HTTP URI is a URL. It is a link. We should be using links. And then when someone looks up one of these URIs, so a URI is just a link that has data associated with it. They should have standards associated with them, which we do. And they should have links to other things so that we can discover more things, so we can build those relationships. So kind of what we talked about years ago in terms of how URIs should work is kind of where we're just starting to now get to, which, progress takes a while. I know there can be some confusion with URIs and a URL and a URN. URN is a uniform resource number. So I've kind of given you the breakdown about how these are, like what the different parts of a URL is. We typically these days, this is probably, here's some trivia for you all who do Trivia Pursuit and might get might get on Jeopardy and get asked the difference. Then here's your diagram. But we kind of call this whole thing a URL these days. I mean, we just don't get so granular with this anymore, but there are definitely still differences. And the other thing that I will see happen is that people will call URIs, even those they will just assume that they're always going to be a URL. And a URI is truly just a uniform resource identifier. That is all it is. And it's only when it is a link that is a URI as a link. And we have kind of now just kind of cobbled in everything with linked data. When you read a lot of linked data documentation, it talks about using URIs. And typically, if you're talking about linked data, that means you're linking to data, right? Linking, that means a link. A link exists. That means it's HTTP URIs. It's a link, it's a URL. And so we've kind of merged all these things together. So there's some good things to kind of think about here, but the short answer is that for linked data to work and be functional, and the reason why I'm talking about this for authorities is because this is the key to making all of this stuff work together, is that it needs to be a link that goes to data and is actionable, that we can use it to pull in those names and subjects. And that's really the important piece of it. So for example, if we go look at the Virtual Internet Authority file, we have the VIF ID, that's a URI. It is a unique resource identifier. It's the Virtual Internet Authority file identifier. And then we have down there the link. And that link is the URI as a URL. So that's that link data that we would link to if we were going to use this. And anyone who is a non-commercial entity or non-commercial organization can use the Virtual Internet Authority file for their authority stuff. So why are we doing this? It's really the principle. It's what makes the linked data piece of it happen. And to me, the key to moving forward on authorities has always been about getting out of the maintenance. Until we can have more link data than we have text strings, we are going to be challenged with how much maintenance work we have to do. And so the more that we can have linked data URIs, the more we can use linked data, the more we can share data across systems. And that also then eliminates that maintenance work. So it's like a win-win for everything. It means we can start including more data in other ways because we also might have some more time to do things, or we don't have to worry that our subjects are going to be outdated or our names are going to be outdated. Now, there's good and bad to that. If you are relying on a central repository, a central database like the Library of Congress subject headings for your names, and the name changes there, but you didn't want to change the name, guess what? Whatever you've linked to is what your patrons are going to see. Now you can do some overrides on your side. You could drop the link, you could go back to a text string, but you do lose that local control and that local maintenance of that. And this gets also really particularly really hot topic when we start talking about who we share data with and whether or not they are going to be sustainable and that they are going to be committed to maintaining that data. If we all are linking to a single repository of data for our names and our subjects, and that whoever owns that or has been maintaining it decides they don't want to do that anymore, we have the potential to lose or break our authorities. So it is something that gets to be, there's a lot of different issues to it. I am hopeful that as we continue to talk about decentralized data in the larger sense, whether or not that we'll have more conversations about how to standardize our data for entities while at the same time decentralizing control over it. Like who maintains what section of it. So if we lose some of it, we only lose part of it. So I think we have a lot of really interesting conversations still to have. And of course, we haven't even quite gotten to the can we all agree on how to do this yet? Which is what we're trying to do, is pull all these communities together to come up with an agreement in terms of how we can do things and what our vision should be of this work at a higher level. Can we do this in MARC records? Can we add link data? Yes, you can. So if you are a cataloger and you are interacting with MARC records, bibliographic records, you're going to see this as a subfield 0. Oh, there's my little double dagger. I did put some of them in. So you'll see it as a subfield 0. That means it is linking to a Library of Congress authority of some kind. These should be URIs. They should be linkable links. It could be just a text string, but it really should be a link. That's the goal of it, is to be a link. Or it could be a subfield 1, and a subfield 1 is what's called a real world object. And these point to link data sources that are considered to be not Library of Congress curated or Library of Congress sponsored, but are considered to be viable sources of data. So these would be something like ORCID. I'm trying to think what else goes in here. I've seen like ResearchGate, and some of those other places have gone into that as well. I think we need to continue to have the conversation more, and we're going to talk much more about that when we get to week 3. But I just wanted, for those of you who do work in MARC records, you may see these already, and if you do, just leave them, because this should be helping to hopefully future-proof us. We have been changing our practice, and this was alluded to with the 2017. So we kind of came up with a hierarchy and a diagram and kind of changed how we talked about people a little bit, but corporate body is still hanging around. So we haven't gotten rid of it completely yet, but I remain ever hopeful that one day it will be gone. So other terms you're going to hear, and this is where we're really starting to talk about that entity piece of it. So we're starting to talk about all the different aspects of the resources. So this could be from a traditional entity management model. This was the systems, persons, and organizations associated. From more of a library perspective, right now, this is the names and the subjects. And to be determined will be things like titles and genres and some of the other things. We then think about how those have identities and what those characteristics of those identities are. So that's a very an older view of identity management, but it is very similar and can be easily mapped to sort of what we're doing now. Thinking about entities, as I said, right now we're talking about persons, groups of people. So groups of people, persons, systems, that's all falls into that name category, and then subjects. So we have two big buckets, as opposed to kind of breaking things out in different ways. And then when we talk about identities, typically we have been talking about names only. So we have been talking about all the groups of people and organizations and things like that, their identities, and then those characteristics. And the characteristics also include things like what they're going to be referred to, their names. But this is also applicable to subjects as well, where we are thinking about how we're going to determine what the term is. What's the source of the controlled vocabulary? What is that term? What does that term mean? What concept does it represent? And what characteristics does it have? So the name of a subject is its term. How is that term represented? So entities, from a cataloging librarian, cataloger standpoint, includes, it really is kind of everything. I mean, it's all of the different resources. So it's the resources themselves that gets to the title piece of it. And then it's the persons, family, corporate bodies, that's all of the groups that are associated with that resource, right? So it is the titles, And it is also then all of the groups of people that are associated with it. And then all of the different aspects that are characteristics that are associated with that person for that goes into the name piece of it. And for title records, it's not quite, we don't have quite that level of granularity in terms, it's more like, how titles are related to each other and things like that. Not every title is going to have its a uniform title. It's only going to be those titles that have been published across many different formats, and the Draculas, the Romeo and Juliets, the I'm trying to think of another another thing like that, but anything that's just been published in many, many formats, languages, versions, all of those kinds of things. That's where you would get the uniform title, where you're trying to bring all of those things together under a single title while still giving access individually. And then of course the multi-part stuff. And that's really the two categories that would have title authorities. There's really not much else that would fall into that category. Under terminology, in terms of names, the preferred name is what we are going to use to create that person's name. And this is usually how they have presented themselves in terms of their presentation of their name on the title page, or it could be on credits of movie screens, things like that. And that's really the basis for setting up that initial authority record or that initial identity data for the name. Subjects are a little more complicated because it depends upon the rules of that particular vocabulary. For example, the Library of Congress subject headings vocabulary does not use scientific terms. So even when dealing with a scientific concept, it's going to use what would be more of a general public, what you might see in the news kind of term. So that's not that's not going to be a good vocabulary for somebody who's maybe in a, hospital or medical college. So you might be using MESH, which is the National Library of Medicine's controlled vocabulary, which is medical terms. Authorized access point is another term you'll see when you're wandering through some of the readings and terminology. This just has to do with when we looked at that string that had the name and also had um, it also had the information about the author. So Flanagan, comma, Terry, and then had author next to it. That authorized access points, that's just all of that information there. And then differentiate is another term and sort of disambiguate sort of the same sort of thing. Differentiate is where you have two names that are the same. All the Robin Fays that are out there in the world, there's a lot of them. When we are creating identity data, we are creating it to be unique. So each Robin Fay, if we were to give every Robin Fay in the universe an identity record, we would want to make sure that there was something to distinguish us. And it could be birth date, it could be death date, it could be profession. It could be, I could be the librarian, somebody else could be the actress. I know there's a real estate agent. There's a whole bunch of us out there, but you kind of use whatever you need to differentiate names, to break what's called break a conflict, so that you don't have more than one name that's exactly the same for different people, because of course that would be confusing and it would give incorrect results. The other thing that happens with that is that we don't just go out and create names for anybody. We only create names for people when we have resources that come to us that need a name. So there are projects out there to kind of retrospectively go through resources, and we'll talk more kind of in the future about some of these projects as well, and sort of the work to go through and sort of add names that may have been overlooked in the past, or sometimes preference was given to a particular name. There's a lot of, it's just a lot of data decisions, some bias, local practice. I mean, there's a lot of different things that get baked into the data. And so there have been some efforts to kind of go back in and address some of that. And so certainly those are kind of separate projects. But as a whole, we only create the names rather than going out looking for every Robin Fay in the whole world and trying to figure out what they've created or not and create a record about them. We typically create things at the point that those that data is needed. So for example, for wiki data, that's created at the point the Wikipedia entry is created, if that name doesn't already exist in their wiki data in some way. So if I write an article and an entry in Wikipedia, and I reference someone who maybe was referenced in a different Wikipedia article, but the article wasn't actually about them. It was just they were kind of referenced as brother of, or whatever the relationship is to that person. Then a name entry may have been created in Wikidata for them, but they didn't actually have an entry. And so in that case, I wouldn't need to create a name. I would just use what was already there. So it's also a way for us to reuse some information as well. So moving from traditional authority records, traditional library authority work, to talking more about structured data. So we've been kind of building on that, moving towards that, talking more about linked data and starting to work with linked data. We'll talk a little bit about knowledge graphs towards the end as we're kind of talking to the future a little bit more, because it's kind of exciting and interesting. But it's a really different way of looking at data than anything we've really talked about. But we'll touch on it because it is really fun, and I'm kind of obsessed with knowledge graphs right now. So we've already talked some about names, but certainly feel free to take a look at any resource that you want to, and take a look at the names and just kind of think about them, and kind of think about them through the data standpoint. For example, we do see in Wikipedia now, they didn't used to do this, but they do now. Well, we'll see in Wikipedia where you look for specific words, you will see things and it'll say like disambiguation next to it. And that means we're going to, go to this data, this entry, and it's going to explain to you different places that Prince appears in Wikipedia. And it's going to, other than Prince the musician, which that for the musician, they're going to just point you right there, right? Prince the musician. So there's an example of using the profession to disambiguate. Now, many of us would say Prince had many more talents besides just being a musician, but he was probably most commonly known as being a musician. And that would be how probably most Wikipedia searchers would be looking for Prince. If they saw Prince the director, or Prince the actor, or Prince the artist, I'm trying to, the fashion designer, some of these other things that he did. I mean, he was so involved in his own, coordinating the whole look and of everything that he did. There's lots of things that they could put there, but certainly he's probably most publicly known as musicians, and they couldn't just list his 5 million things that he did because that'd be a little long. So they've kind of picked the thing that most people would be most likely to see. Now, if you go read his entry, it'll talk about a lot more things, and certainly it can continue to be added to. So Wikipedia, so where does, that Prince name as musician, where does that actually come from? Well, if we actually go look at the Wikidata side of it, then we can see a little bit more information, and we can see where they've actually combined some records together, and they've actually, kind of pulled together some information. So they do try to, pull together information as much as they can, just like we do. So again, this is a community of practice that has been doing very similar work to what libraries have been doing. And there's communities like this in many different, many different communities have been working on these kinds of projects. And so looking at how we can collaborate together, because libraries, especially, lots of libraries have lots of material that would have Prince as a subject heading or a name. So if we could combine all of that data and kind of have one giant wonderful record of all the data and all the wonderful things that Prince is, then that'd be really cool. And we could have this thing that's just includes so much more information, and would really help our users maybe find something if they're looking for Prince the actor, or if they're looking for Joey Coco, or I didn't even know about Alexander Nevermind. So some of these other things out there. So there's a lot of things that make this work really important here. And certainly it goes beyond the privacy, security, and access that we talked about at the first part of it, about the finding the resources, exploring those related resources. Um, for individuals, it can also help with managing their reputation or their sort of digital credibility. So it can even help with that, and certainly it can help with genealogy and historical research, interoperability, interoperable data to make our data more compatible, and the similar things for subjects. It can have same thing, finding resources, finding related resources, assisting in citation discovering, finding other things that are related, and again, creating that interoperable data so that we can share things. And we're going to talk much more about the complexity of data next week, and it will not be, my part of it will not be as long, but it really is a very complex process, and it is about multiple things. And it's partially is because the identities themselves are complex. Subjects are complex in their own way too, especially when we look at how different communities may have the same concept but use different terms. And so, especially when you have communities that are multiple cultures or, have different language needs. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways that we may encounter this. So subjects, I think, are more dynamic than they seem not on the surface. The bigger issue, I think, with subjects is just that the process to add to or change subjects is by committee. So there is a large committee and you have to do it is a formal process to propose a new Library of Congress subject heading. And part of the reason for that is because it does impact changing a gigantic controlled vocabulary. And they have to figure out where it goes in the hierarchy, and it has that relationship to a call number. So it really is a very complex thing to get right, and it's going to then potentially impact libraries and their own maintenance. So the subjects piece of this is really complicated because of the mechanics of maintaining such a large controlled vocabulary. And on top of that, it's text oriented. So until we get to linked data, and linked data for subjects and Library of Congress subject headings is much more complicated than linked data for names. But until we can get to more linked data and we can alleviate some of the maintenance piece of it, and take some of the burden off libraries in terms of having to keep up or make changes, that's until that can be reduced, that is always going to be a factor in terms of how frequently subjects get changed. Now, it is the Library of Congress, and that does, at least for the Library of Congress subject headings, the Library of Congress genre headings, that does play into it. And I did not, in my lifetime, think that the Library of Congress would start wading into the controlled vocabulary used by libraries, but they have now done it on a few occasions, that the politics have wandered into the Library of Congress subject headings. We have seen it now several times where there's either been efforts to change things or push for changes, or just a mandate saying we're just going to change the name of this thing, and you all just fix the data. It is complicated, and I think because of that, that's a piece of it that it's something for us to acknowledge, because it challenges how responsive we can be. And it also is part of the discussion we need to have when some change that will impact us greatly is just like pushed on us, and we are not given a chance to really, build any kind of process to go back and change things, or, to do that as a project work. It's just, things don't change overnight with these kinds of projects if you have to do it manually. And I think that is something that is a little bit of a challenge for this work, because for people who don't work in libraries, if you work with a digital archive or a website or something, you may have more dynamic data that is either you can just change it in a batch process, as some of the projects I've worked on. You can just kind of change it one place and it changes everything, or you can change the display of it, but the data stays the same. So, it only matters The display really is what matters to the public anyway, and the data is just kind of behind the scenes. So who kind of cares about that except for us, right? So, there are other options, but when there's not time to kind of do that work, I think that makes it much more complicated. So names are a little bit easier in the fact that it's a single entity, it's a single text string, it's a single data source to that particular name. So it's not a combined. Some subject headings are a combination of multiple subject headings kind of chained together. And so that complicates maintenance work too. So it really is a much more complicated project. And, you know, we can benefit, and I think this is really where we're going with entity management, is we can benefit by combining together and collaborating together to kind of pull all of this together so that we can bring our expertise to the table and our years of experience of doing this, while at the same time starting to learn from other communities of practice that are doing things in a different way. And that's something that I was really excited about when I started working on non-MARC projects, is that I was super excited to get to work with authorities and work with subject headings and work with some of these things I'd wanted to do differently, but was so constrained by my other systems. Now, once I got working into these other systems, I sometimes saw the good and the bad, as we do. But there are really some good opportunities if we can work together across these communities to really build some practices that are actually sustainable and that are going to leverage all these new technologies and maybe push even our systems forward. So I'm super duper excited about all the work we're doing. So why would other communities not follow us? Well, for one thing, they've been doing their own thing. And two, they bring their own expertise to this work. And many library catalogers are generalists. We catalog in public libraries, we catalog in school libraries, we catalog in academic libraries, and we may be an expert in format. Maybe you're a serials cataloger or you're a um, special collections cataloger. We do not, and sometimes we have language expertise catalogers where we have people who are cataloging specific languages, but we do not have as much as a whole. We do not have as much expertise by subject. So sometimes you have a science cataloger, but in large academic libraries, these days at least, you're more likely to have somebody who's going to be format specific or is going to be cataloging by language, or maybe if there's like some emerging formats, like some of the 3D and virtual reality formats, there's actually specific formats associated, file formats and things like that associated with those. And most of those don't have standards yet for even how they create those files. So, there's a lot of kind of emerging standards kind of things like that. So, in this case, you may have some sort of special formats librarian or something like that that might be more STEM oriented, or maybe a medical librarian because they're going to be working with a different vocabulary. But I would say as a whole, when you look at across the landscape of cataloging, we have a tendency to be generalist. And of course, we try to do the best job as we can. And some of us develop expertise in specific areas of interest. Or maybe you work in a library. That I worked in a library, had been a military college and had a huge military collection. So boy, did I learn about military cataloging and how to catalog military material. So, you just learn what you kind of work with, but we don't have a tendency to be like subject specific other than what we bring to the table as our own interest or our own knowledge or what we learn through experience. Whereas other communities of practice, if you have someone working in a museum, a lot of times they have a very deep expertise in, say, maybe, 20th century art, or their thing is Renaissance, or, the Rococo period, or whatever. They have a very deep interest in a particular area. And the same thing with music catalogers, I would say, have a tendency to be a little more specialized, but for the most part, we do kind of catalog as more generalist, I think, than anything. So we can certainly tap into the expertise and combine all of our expertise to kind of build these things that are going to work for everybody. The other thing I will say is, for the library community, we have a tendency as metadata practitioners, when you look at the larger web, we are a small community and a shrinking community compared to the larger digital asset management community, the larger web community. I've been to web and IT conferences where web developers have talked about metadata and talked about things, and I'm like, they're just talking about cataloging and metadata work, but they're giving it different words. And, I think the other part that we have not been able to leverage so much on the library catalog side of it is that because we're in MARC, we're still very text oriented, and we haven't been able to really rely on automation or to be able to leverage it as we could. So hopefully we've been starting to have these conversations. Certainly the IT side has been doing this for a while. They do with even identity management as authentication processes. So much of that is becoming like, automated and single sign-in and that kind of stuff. So much more looking at how technology can do the lifting. And I think it's not that library cataloging hasn't wanted to change. We are kind of still stuck in that MARC piece of it. And I think that piece of it it's both familiar, and at the same time, it's frustrating and familiar because it is challenging to work with, especially when trying to do this, trying to have data that is more accessible across a larger platform. Scope of work differs. We are typically working with a set quantity of data and information. So we know what we are describing and what we're working with. We don't just kind of randomly, typically, sometimes we do, but we don't randomly just go out and look for resources. They usually come to us and we kind of know what we're working on. And, certainly if you're working on larger projects, that may not be the case, or something like the Digital Public Library of America, or some of these large Merlot, or some of these other large repository projects, you're getting data and resources from kind of anywhere, just about. And of course, we just aren't as tied into that IT side of things as we probably could be, just because of sort of how our work has been framed and housed. And I think our history of the library card catalog is really cool. And there's so much of it that I think we should be really proud of how much work we've set in terms of the foundation and kind of keeping things running. I think is one of the best things, most amazing things about the library side of the house. Well, and some of our other colleagues too, working in museums and archives and things like that, especially those of you running on little budgets and shoestrings, keeping it all tied together with duct tape and super glue. But, thinking about how we can be part of this larger environment to leverage some of that skills without reducing our quality. And I think that's the piece that we have that is so wonderful, is that we bring so much to quality to this. I think the other thing that kind of impacts this work as a whole too is we don't really know. They guard those algorithms so closely, and no matter how many people write about the algorithms and what they search, or if you sign up for a workshop or whatever, it's all still very closely guarded proprietary secrets. And that's the same thing with even our discovery layers. Like, they do tell us what they search a lot of times in terms of which fields they search, but they don't always tell us exactly how, like when it comes to relevance ranking and things like that. Some of them are more upfront than others, for sure, but the search piece of it is sometimes a mystery, a little bit of a mystery for us. So we're trying to also make sure that we're building data that is as accessible as possible to these systems. So as we go throughout class, we're going to be looking at projects that are building identity resources. We're going to be talking more about this move towards identity management, what it means. I'm going to be sharing some resources from the committee work, what's been publicly available. So I'll share that with you so you can kind of take a look at it. And then we will be looking at what the libraries are doing, some of the projects that are out there, some of the non-library projects that are out there. And we will spend some time looking with Wikidata and really talking more about the data of Wikidata and Wikipedia, because that to me is such a fascinating project in terms of how they do things. Different communities, but similar goals. And that's the important piece of this, is that we don't want to lose what our different communities bring to this work. and we want to really leverage that expertise. And we want to make sure we keep our controlled vocabulary aspect of it because it's important. People have data and connections too. And this was a project from a long time ago, and I loved it that you could put in all your social media back when I did a lot more social media, and it would kind of give you these info mind mappy kind of graphs of your connections to things. And this was just one little piece I put together. But I just thought it was such a cool idea, and it would kind of give you the keywords that were associated with you, which was kind of fun. But there's a lot of data mining to happen out there and potential to data mine. And the more we can figure out a way to leverage our data in terms of bringing our expertise into the work, the better it's going to be, I think, in terms of the larger web. Let's see. I think we've talked about all of these things. I'm just trying to make sure I've hit everything that we want to talk about. I think we all know the barriers to our work and participation. Mark, yes. We've talked some about the terminology and language that we use being on the library side being outdated. We do have a little bit still in libraries of focus on the inventory aspect of our work versus the universe of resources. And I think that's an interesting consideration. We won't be talking too much about it, but just as you kind of think, if you work in a library, kind of think about the work that you do and how that falls into patrons being able to actually use that resource, check it out, that inventory tracking of that resource, and how the data you create falls into that, because it is something that we don't talk too much about. We just kind of put it all together in one big system, and we don't talk too much about the data that we create to describe the resource and how that falls into or supports the inventory tracking piece of it. Let's see, I think we talked all about these things. Next week, we're going to talk much more about people and life and how dynamic everything is and how our data should be too. So that should be a fun conversation. I hope it's such an interesting thing to think about, that it's not just people changing their names. It's kind of, and people change their names for lots of reasons, but it's also just kind of like all the changes that are out there. And even thinking about in the United States, how the United States grew, and as data, if data had been created and for some of those older resources back there, it would represent some of these older names, even for the United States. So it is very interesting to think about how places and geographic names change, especially with politics. And, we've seen this with countries and with cities and all kinds of things where we see names changing. Doing the work. I think we've talked most about this, that we have standards and guidelines that define how we're doing work. Currently, this work's called authority work. So entity management is this sort of new way of kind of framing it and looking for more leverage of technology solutions, and also looking to see how we can be more collaborative. So it may be that as we go forward, authority is still the library piece of it, and we kind of keep that name, but the entity management may be the piece that we talk about at sort of that larger conceptual framework for this work. So next steps. Next week will not be so long, but, work through the knowledge check, do the readings, participate and produce. I don't know why I was thinking produce, but participate in class discussion, and I will see you next time.